New murmurs out of Utah that the Utes, not happy with the Big 12, could leave the conference, go independent, and make more money. This is a Locked On Big 12, Locked On Utes crossover.
You are Locked On Big 12, your daily podcast on the Big 12 Conference. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Happy Monday, everybody. Welcome to a Locked On Big 12, Locked On Utes crossover. I'm Drake Toll from America's #1 Big 12 podcast, Locked On Big 12. Thank you for making this show your first listen every single day. That is JT Wistersill of Locked On Utes. We are going to get into Utah exiting the Big 12 as a new independent team in college football, how that would impact the Utes if that decision is where they go. And Utah was one quarterback away from a Big 12 championship in 2024. That's a pretty popular theory amongst Utes fans. Let's back it up or deny it. And BYU illegally stealing Utah players. We will finally, once and for all, hear from the guy who had the source on his show, talk about his thoughts on that rumor. If you hit subscribe, we both get to keep our jobs. JT, it was a message board post from a message board idiot. Fighting Utes says, should Utah consider independence, leaving this sorry conference and the schedule cupcakes like BYU cupcakes like BYU or Notre Dame, guaranteed playoffs almost every year, huge payouts, wouldn't have to share the money, could easily exceed Big 12 cash. Is it the right move for a Utah to replicate what BYU did for so long and go independent?
Well, first, I love the comments like that because I obviously try to push back on the narrative. Like, overall, we are happy to be in this conference, but then you're always going to get those fans that aren't. So that's unfortunate. If it was possible, almost every team should try and do what Notre Dame is doing, right? I mean, just from the simple fact of the math. Notre Dame wins. They get $14 million, right, Drake, you said?
Sure, yeah. It's ton.
Yeah, it's like $14 million to themselves versus when Texas wins. Here you go, SEC distributed it to everyone else. So if you could go independent and do that, everyone should do it. There's a massive problem, though. Not everyone's Notre Dame. Utah shouldn't do this. They couldn't survive. You just can't. You need the backing of a conference. You need that TV money. Notre Dame can do it because what are they? Such a strong brand that NBC was willing to say, hey, here's a massive sum of TV money so that we can play your games on our network. Gosh, if Utah were to do that, I mean, could they get maybe a TNT? It's not worth it. It's really not. And then how does that even work with the teams they're playing? There's too many logistics to figure out. Utah is nowhere near the brand that Notre Dame. When Utah was firing on all cylinders, when they were back-to-back Pac-12 champs, I thought they were at that moment a top 25 program in the sport. But historically, they've never been a top 25 program when you look at overall totality. So their brand value has never been high enough to justify what a Notre Dame would do. It'd be awesome if you could win playoff games and get $14 million to yourself, but it's not feasible for Utah to make it by themselves.
I don't think you're right. You're right.
Wow. Okay.
And what I'm about to say will likely not make Utah fans very happy, but here's why I don't think you're right. BYU is independent, and I would liken those two schools to one another, like sister schools, right? If you were comparing brands, and the Utah and BYU are very similar. Mm-hmm. BYU in independence, 2011 goes 10-3, 2020 11-1, 2021 10-3 in a 12-team playoff format. Those 3 years, BYU's probably in the college football playoff or at the very least in the conversation. Mm-hmm. So who's to say that Utah couldn't do the same? Look, you wouldn't play world beaters. You wouldn't play Ohio State and Michigan every year. You'd play Stanford and Utah State and South Alabama. And then you'd sprinkle in, of course, in Illinois, right? You craft that schedule like Notre Dame does, and you're walking into the college football playoff most years.
I don't think they could. I don't think you have enough revenue to pay players in today's era with the amount you're walking away from. And I would need to go back and look at schedules and all the things of that nature. But I feel like it would have been hard for BYU to get in a lot of those years. Drake, you mentioned that. I mean, I can't remember the last time before this year they finished the season ranked inside the top 15 outside of COVID year 2020, Zach Wilson, heck of a team. That team would have been a really good addition to the 12-team playoff. Outside of that, I can't remember when they finished in that range because they would still they'd be a 9-3 team or somewhere in that span, but they'd have some really bad losses. I'm talking Northern Illinois times 2, basically. So I just don't think you can make it by yourself in today's era where NIL comes in and you won't get a strong enough TV deal to make the money, to make the revenue. I just think it's too hard right now. You're turning down too much money. And sure, if you got in and won a couple games, I guess, but there are so many logistics and things that you have to go through here that I don't think Utah would be able to overcome. BYU would probably fare better as an independent than Utah would because of that brand. I'm not saying in terms of like, hey, if Utah was independent the last 10 years versus BYU, but I do think in today's era moving forward, and we're seeing that right now, BYU has better NIL resources than Utah has been reported so far. So I do feel like BYU would have a better shot at that, but I don't think either Utah, BYU. I think there's 10 programs, and maybe that's being too small of a number, that could do what Notre Dame was and consistently win games in the CFP. I don't think Utah or BYU or unfortunately any Big 12 school could manage it.
Yeah, that BYU year of 2021, they played a top 20. They played and beat top 25 Arizona State, top 25 Utah, Arizona, Boise State. They lost that game to Boise State, but they played Boise State, played Baylor, played Washington State, played USC, and beat them in the regular season. I mean, they were ranked 13th in the country going into the bowl game, 12th maybe, and so they're in the conversation, right? They proved that hey, in a 12-team playoff format, being independent is not the worst thing in the world. Now, I would push back for different reasons, and you mentioned it a bit. Probably my major reason would be the TV contracts. That's a huge, you put that in there. I would put that at A1. And also conference affiliation, bringing in money when you don't make the college football playoff. So Utah didn't go, but they're getting money because Arizona State did. There will be money put in Utah. So the years that Notre Dame doesn't go, they just get $0, whereas the Big 12 is always guaranteed a payout from the College Football Playoff Committee. But I do want to go back to Mark Harlan, Kyle Whittingham. It's not insane to say, and it's not even disrespectful to say, they're probably not the happiest campers in the world with being in the Big 12. I'm sure they're not going to bed at night dreaming about how good they've got it in this conference. If given the opportunity to go somewhere else, do you think they'd at least consider?
I do. If it's a Big Ten or SEC, right? Like, I think that's where, is there a world, the ACC? Yeah. I think everyone's trying to get into the Big Ten and SEC. So it's not something like Utah's against the Big 12. It's just a matter of, hey, this is where football becomes a business. Where can you make the most money? That's clearly in the Big Ten and the SEC. And as much as I'd love to push back, Drake, on what you kind of mentioned about Utah maybe not be the happiest in the Big 12, gosh, if we were going to make a power rankings of who's probably the least happy, unfortunately, when you look at Mark Harlan's comments and even the things Kyle Whittingham has said in the past about just saying like, hey, conference realignment's a real thing. Yeah. Utah would probably have to be number one based on what is available there. I do believe Utah's happy at the Big 12. I think they're looking forward to continuing this partnership, but look, it's college football and it is a business at the end of the day. It's about how much money you can make. If you get that Big Ten SEC invite where you can make double what you make in the conference, then you're going to go. That's how I look at it. But what's best for Utah's football brand is to stay in the Big 12. I don't want Utah to become Nebraska. Like when Nebraska went to the Big Ten, they have fallen off completely as a brand. And Utah's obviously not where they used to be even a couple of years ago right now. But I mean, Utah could easily win the conference in 2025 and none of us would fall out of our chair. If Utah next year was in the Big 10, we would all fall out of our chair if they somehow went through the gauntlet and beat Ohio State and Oregon all in the same season, because that's not something they've done. They almost did it that one year, but that's not really replicable.
Interesting. Utah could win the Big 12 next year. We wouldn't fall out of our chair. I mean, don't pretend it. I heard it. I heard you say it on this show just now.
After what Arizona State did, I'm going to say no. I'm not going to rule anyone out.
16th. Let's do that. Utah would have won the Big 12. That's a take that you have. Would have won the Big 12 with the quarterback, and you can make the Dylan Gabriel statement. Oklahoma with or without, right? They were so much better with quarterback. Could Utah have won the conference? Let's talk about it on Locked On Big 12 and Locked On Utes, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. Today's show is brought to you by TurboTax. Yes, tax season, baby. And this is a message from sponsor Intuit TurboTax. Taxes was dealing with piles of paperwork and frustrating forms, and then waiting and wondering and worrying if you were going to get any money back. Now Taxes is easily uploading your forms to a TurboTax expert who's matched to your unique tax situation. An expert who's backed by the latest technology, which cross-checks millions of data points for 100% accuracy. While they work on your taxes, you get real-time updates on their progress, and you get the most money back guaranteed, all while you go about your day. No stressing. No worrying, no waiting. Now is taxes. Intuit TurboTax. Go to TurboTax.com to get an expert. Only available with TurboTax Live full service, real-time updates only in iOS mobile app. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantee. JT Westercell, this is the part of the show where you're allowed to be insufferable. Utah was one quarterback away from winning the Big 12 championship in 2024. Yes or no?
Oh, you're the best. I do think they would have fallen just short, even if Cam had stayed healthy. But I say fallen short as in I think they would have been right there and it come down to the wire. I want to take everyone back to before the season started, why Utah was picked, not just by me, as a lot of people seem to think I was the only one who was trying to campaign them sometimes. Almost everyone. And Drake, did you pick? I think you went with Kansas, but you had Utah at least in the championship game, right, my friend?
I had Utah, who went 5-7 in the championship against Kansas, who went 5-7. Yeah,
exactly. So it's also your fault too. But Spencer is McLaughlin. He picked Utah to make it.
Utah and Kansas, by the way.
Oh yeah,
and Joel Klatt, Utah and Kansas.
College Game Day, that graphic when it was all Utah and when they were making their preseason predictions of who was going to win the conference. Why was that? Because this roster looked really good on paper. And it wasn't just that. It was the schedule too. I mean, how many of the games too, I will say, like if you want to make the argument that Utah would have won, I could easily make that argument that Utah would have been Big 12 champs, especially when you look at all of their games they played. They lost their 7 of their last 8. So it's like, how could you say that? But the most important position on the field is quarterback. And almost all those games, the biggest reason they lost it was because of poor quarterback play. So if Cam Rising's in there, you're not going to get poor quarterback play, at least the healthy Cam Rising, not the one we saw against Arizona State. And all of them were a game in the fourth quarter. Even the games where you're like Arizona, the game, that was 23-10. Utah had several chances to make that a game. The Colorado game ended up being a blowout, but Utah was right there in that one too. Gosh, Utah with even bad quarterback play nearly beat BYU at home, right? So that's where the schedule was also in theory lining up for them. When we thought that Arizona was going to be really good, when BYU ends up being your rival at home, Iowa State being really good, you get them at home. That's where at the time when a Utah team that really hadn't lost at home multiple times in the season since like 2017, I think it was, until this last year. So the defense pretty much lived up to their end of the bargain. They had a couple lapses, but if Utah would have just averaged that 38 points per game that they averaged the last time Cam Rising was healthy, they only would have lost to Colorado. So I think it's pretty easy. I said at the start of this, though, I think they would have fallen a little bit short. Look, ASU just seemed like a team of destiny this year. Cam Scadaboo, Sam Levitt, what they were able to do, Kenny Dillingham. I think Utah would have had a chance to win that game at Arizona State. Maybe they wouldn't have, but I don't know. I just feel like it was Arizona State's year. I really do. As high as I was on Utah, I feel like it was ASU's year.
I don't know, JT. Again, I want to push back a bit here on you. When that game was played, it didn't feel like to me Arizona State was in their stride. We didn't know what we were going to get out of Arizona State at that time. I do believe you take that game itself into context, Utah's got a really good shot to win it. If not only they have a quarterback, but if Cam Rising is who we were promised and who we saw in 2022. Like what's wild to me is I don't want this to be Utah would have won the Big 12 with a healthy Cam Rising. Utah would have won the Big 12. They're one quarterback away. And it might not have been Rising who could have been that guy for the Utes. Did you think in the sample size that you saw that Cam Rising was 2022 level, or was like could he have been the catalyst to a Big 12 title, or would it have had to have been a somebody else, another competent quarterback somewhere out there?
I mean, if Cam could have stayed healthy, I think he would have rounded into form. But I will agree that looking back on even his first few games, I thought he looked like a quarterback who was still shaking off rust, which is understandable because the stat I love to throw around before I came on your show in the past, Drake, was the whole Tom Brady thing. That Tom Brady had played a game more recently until Cam did. But even when he got hurt in the Baylor game, he still missed a throw or two. The offense was stalling a little bit. So I think he would have eventually rounded into form of a guy who could have helped Utah contend for a Big 12 championship. But obviously we saw him against Arizona State. He got hurt the third play of the game and was never himself. The reason I'll go back to why I think Utah would have fallen short even if Cam was healthy, if we're going to do the what if game, we could also easily do what if Sam Levitt doesn't get hurt in that game. He missed a large chunk of time against Utah in that game. So if he stays healthy, then their foot has to stay on the gas pedal even more, because then you're going touchdown for touchdown maybe if Utah's offense is firing more. I think it would have been hard for Utah to win there. I would, with a healthy Cam Rising, I'm saying that the 1 point difference does swing against BYU. They win there. Coming into the year, I always thought Colorado was a bad matchup for Utah. I think they would have still probably lost that game, even though that was a winnable game. Shador, that passing offense against a pretty good Utah secondary, but still having trouble against one of the best offenses in college football, unless you're playing BYU, obviously, in the Alamo Bowl, because I still can't believe what the Cougars did to them there. I think Utah would have had 2 losses, and I think maybe it would have been some of those, and still gotten in the conference championship game, but that's where I give ASU the edge. Utah could have been right there. Cam Rising could have been the guy if he got healthy to make this team a contender again. If they'd gotten 22 Rising, very well could have won the conference. Like I said, I'm still going to lean with them falling just short because also it is Utah football, Drake. And unfortunately, as we know, even if Cam could have somehow been healthy, there were several other guys that were going to be hurt.
Can I go back and just dig up some bones here with you?
Sure. Let's do it.
When that Arizona game happened, because you win at Oklahoma State, you prove that, okay, maybe Isaac Wilson could be the guy against Utah State, and then you win against Oklahoma State on the road.
And we can play Big 12 football. That was a big thing. Like people were talking about the softness of the Pac-12. I never bought into that narrative, and I think a lot of people watched Utah didn't, but that was a big thing too. So that was such a big win for Utah.
Yeah, and that was top 15. We still thought Oklahoma State, who was undefeated, we thought this was the matchup of the Big 12. This is going to determine who goes to Arlington and represents the conference in the college football playoff. Obviously, that goes really south for both of the schools. What was it like? Like, take me back into the moment in the war room during that Arizona game when they stretched the lead to double digits and you realize Utah's going to lose.
So just disheartening. I mean, you feel like, and I will say there was a chance where you're like, okay, just Isaac Wilson is clearly not ready. Cam Rising will be back soon, and then hopefully you can rebound there. But I mean, even that game, just pulling back up the numbers, Isaac was 20 for 40. He had 280 yards. But I remember Utah came up short on a lot of the money downs, 2 interceptions. One of those put Arizona in prime position too. And that was a really deflating game because Utah hadn't lost to an unranked team at home since maybe even further back than 2017. I can't remember when that was too. So that was where it's like, whoa, what's going on here? You follow that up with you get him back against Arizona State, but then it goes even worse than there. And then come to find out at the end of the season too, like at the time it was like, well, Isaac Wilson balled out on the road against a top 15 team. But then we learned what Oklahoma State was. They have one of the worst defenses in college football. So it really was just kind of a false performance from what this Utah football team would end up being. Man, I thought this Utah team after that Oklahoma State game was on their way to probably just lose one game in conference action and then go on to win the Big 12. But injuries played a massive role, the biggest one being quarterback. And it is amazing how different the tone is, even for myself, talking about this Utah football program rather than last year when I felt like they were coming to the Big 12 with a lot of returners, a lot of optimism. And that has changed, even though there are a few reasons for excitement entering 25.
Coming up, BYU illegally stealing Utah players? Question mark. This is a Locked On Big 12 Locked On Utes crossover. Today's show is brought to you by Game Time. Game Time is where I go to get my tickets. Coming up under the Big Sky Festival in Whitefish, Montana. How do I find cheap tickets? Game Time. And how do I find tickets to attending the 12-team college football playoff game? Game Time. Atlanta is like 4 hours from me. I live in Savannah, Georgia. I can just go watch it. I want cheap tickets. Game Time's the place to go. And with the new feature, Game Time Picks, it makes tickets for events even easier to get in your hands. Filters out the fluff to show you incredible deals on great seats. Recently, used Game Time Picks to find tickets for that national championship game. And boy, are they actually really reasonable. I love that I can see the seats before I buy them as well. The app shows you the total cost up front with no surprise fees at checkout. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices, and that is a guarantee with Game Time. JT Wistrcill of Locked On Utes. This feels kind of like an Ellen or an Oprah deal where I get to tell all. You were there when an analyst comes on your show and alludes to BYU promising NIL money they can't deliver on, and the conversation was based around, are the Cougars tampering and what is going on in the transfer portal between BYU and Utah. And that blew up. Message boards, podcast, everywhere. People wanted to know more about this allegation, and you were sitting right there when it happened. I want to know your explanation for what was said, what you know from other sources around you, and looking back to today, what's new, right? Where's the update? Is that something that had legs?
Look, Alex has his sources. I know you had Jake Hatch on last week, and he has his sources. So the college football is an incredibly complicated space right now, and NIL deals are incredibly complicated and everything that happens in there. So I'm not going to try to do who's reporting, who was correct, who wasn't, because then I love Jake, I love Alex, I appreciate both those guys so much. So I don't really want to take a stance on either one of them and be like, oh, this is exactly what's going on, because I can't speak for what I've been told in terms of I haven't heard from like, hey, this is exactly what's going on behind the scenes. So I want to respect those two guys reporting and say right there. What I do want to talk about though is the tampering stuff. That to me is something that it has so many people talking about right now, what is going on. And I also want to clarify and narrow this down a little bit, because Drake, you've talked about this a lot on your show too. And I want to narrow it down what I think most Utah fans' frustration is about. This is not about a guy in Hunter Clegg coming back from his mission and going to BYU. That happens all the time. I don't think there's anything off or different about that situation. This is not about even a Carson Ryan who, right as the way the portal opens, and he's gone. He says right away, like, I'm gone. I'm going to enter the portal and go from there. So this is another situation. I want to just focus on what happened to Keanu Tanuvasu. Tanuvasu, if you guys have, most of you probably know the story by now, right? Says, I'm a Utah man, shades another Utah player for leaving, then decides to leave. As soon as he decided to enter the portal, reports came out from several, whether it's Josh Furlong, who covers Utah very closely. He's one of the main beat reporters at KSL.com. Then you get a guy in Alex Markham of Utah Rivals, who does a really good job covering Utah as well. You get Steve Bartle, who had a piece on KSL Sports, said, according to sources, there was zero indication that Tanuvasa's transfer was imminent. Yes, his decision to enter the portal was likely fueled by the market for defensive linemen. These are credible journalists who are not just pulling things out of their butt. I absolutely believe an NIL deal was in place. Now, I do also want to say this. Is BYU doing something illegal and all these things of that nature? I'm sure by the letter of the law like that, when we get into tampering, whatever you want to say about tampering. But guess what? Everyone in college football is tampering right now. I'm sure Utah's been involved in some of it. I think everyone has been involved in tampering in one way or another. And there's no evidence that you can really cling to. And you might say that's kind of crazy for you just to say that. But also just, it really doesn't take that long of a Google search to see how many other college football coaches are accusing this person of tampering and that person of tampering. And I'll also say this, Keanu Tanuvasa's dad came out anyways and said, hey, after New entered the portal, New being his son, that Utah offered enough to keep him, but he chose BYU. So good for Tanuvasa for making that choice. I don't know ill will towards Tanuvasa, but to act like nothing happened when he said he was going to stay at Utah, then shades another player for leaving, then ends up deciding to leave, and then these reporters that I trust are saying that an NIL deal was involved, then yeah, I'm going to lean towards that as there was something going on behind the scenes. But BYU is not the only one. Utah's probably done it too. Like I said, this is widespread in college sports right now.
Yeah. There are high school coaches, trainers, little league, whoever that are involved in these, who get a call from, it doesn't have to be, Kalani Sitake could have had nothing to do with this. Kyle Whittingham.
Really quick, can I say something? The Kalani Sitake, I've put nothing into Kalani Sitake going up to Carson Ryan, Keanu Tanuvasa after the game. That is coincidence all the way around. I do not think there was anything there with how long after it was. Could he have maybe said, like, I'd love for you to be a kook? Yeah, I'm sure he said that to 80 other Utah players at some point. Kyle Whittingham might have been saying the same thing to them for Utah. So I don't think there was anything wrong with that. And I've always been a big fan of Kalani Sitake.
Yeah, I don't think that he was involved in a war room here where he's on the phone with a kid. He can't be. Yeah. You start leaving a trail that is undeniable, and that's how you get fired in college football. Though there could have been a BYU donor. I tomorrow, as someone who graduated from Baylor, I could pick up the phone and I could call Cam Scatterbo and say, hey, come back, use a year of eligibility, go to Baylor, I'll pay you $5 million. And the NCAA can't crack down on Baylor. They can't crack down on me. What are they going to do? Fine me? They can't. They don't have. It's not within their bounds to call the donor and be like, oh, can't do that. I could DM tomorrow any member of the Utah football team and say, I will give you $5 million to go play for BYU, to go play for Texas Tech, to go play for Baylor. And that is certainly happening because coaches don't have to be involved in that. It is as simple as direct. We've never been so connected with everybody in the world.
Mm-hmm. It is. And that's exactly right. This is not Kalani Sitake saying, hey, this is the plan. Let's go do this. This is agents are more than anything. It's not even college football teams as much as I think it is the agents trying to base the value and then trying to maximize that. I think it was Coach Norvell, the one at Colorado State, had a big statement on this about what agents are kind of doing and how much money they end up taking from the NIL deal. So college, it's covering this sport is an insane time right now because of the NIL, because of the tampering. Drake, what other year can you remember players tweeting out like, I'm going to stay at this school, or even we've seen guys commit to schools and then decommit days later and put their names right back in the portal, and then they'll go somewhere else. It's unlike anything I've ever seen before.
It's chaotic for sure. And I think it's cool when a player says I'm staying home and they don't go anywhere. Less cool when they say that and they end up leaving. Could have gone without the graphic. And man, this brings out the worst every time. And this has nothing to do with a single player that I want to call out individually, but I see it all. A Utah Man I Am, or Hook'em, or Sick'em, or any of those. No, you're not. You're the opposite of a Utah Man, actually. You left. You don't go there anymore. You can't enter the transfer portal like, hey, thanks for my time. Great 2 years. We're a family. All right, sure. A Utah Man I Am. No, you're telling me that you're not that thing anymore. You can't just be like, this is home. No, it's not. No, it's not. You're choosing to leave for whatever reason that may be, and you no longer wear that. You're wearing someone else's logo on you. You're like they said, Blake Shapen will always be a Baylor Bear. He's not. He's actively a Mississippi State Bulldog. He's actively doing a thing that is not the Baylor Bears. So that's the chaos that always gets under my skin. But JT, looking back on that segment, looking back and now in the tell-all, is there anything you would have done differently? Anything you feel like should have been clarified?
I wish look here, and I've said this before. Alex, if you watch the full episode, Alex is very connected, and he is not just going to risk his journalistic, if I just make up a word, I think, reputation to stir just a random rumor. And that's the one thing I'll say. I wish I had said, hey, Alex, is this what you're hearing? Like, I wish I had stopped the whole thing in that moment, but I also didn't want to interrupt him. I wanted to let him talk for you. So that's why I wish I would have just said that. But also, once again, like, listen to the full episode. Go back and listen to the episode I had with him on December 9th, I think it was. He talked about Kyle Whittingham coming back, offers great insight into what's going on there. And if he had stopped every 10 seconds to say, hey, sources said this, we would have been there for an hour long. So that's another big thing I want everyone to keep in mind like that. Watch the full episode. Look at the way he is presenting his information. And he is not just throwing things out there to see and try if they land, if they stick. Utah Rivals has been on the Utah beat for a long time. Alex Markham does a really good job covering Utah. And I know, look, you don't have to like it. You don't have to believe it. That's your choice. But the people who act like Alex has made this up, and I said this on my own show, once again, he's not going to risk his reputation. That's all I'm going to say.
JT, where can folks find more of your work?
Or where can they hate on me for probably half the people in this? Anyway, so that's at JT Wistersill on X. You could go over and Locked On Utes on YouTube as well. Always talking all things Utah as the offseason is very chaotic. Drake, always great hopping on with you.
Absolutely. It's been one of the biggest stories so far of the offseason, the BYU and Utah possible tampering allegations, whatever. It's been big. So glad to hear from you and glad that we clarified a good portion of that. This has been and always will be. Keep coming back the rest of this week for all of your Utah Utes and Big 12 content. Locked On. Thanks for making it your first listen every single day. Dose Grande.